Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor and I'm a fellow at the Foundation. I'm very glad to be here today with Yousef Munayyer. Yousef is the head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington. He also serves as a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of Palestine Studies and was previously executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Yousef, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ahmed.
Yousef, we're going to be talking today, just kind of a broad survey to begin with, over assessing what's changed over the past 3 years. And then we're going to go deep on the BDS movement. And finally, would love to get your perspective on what happens next. Obviously, the situation in Palestine is dynamic, but there's a trajectory. And if anybody can evaluate what that trajectory looks like and where things are going, it's somebody with your experience and your deep understanding of the issues and players. So just to start, you've been in Washington. We were just talking. You and I probably met around 2008, 2009. I think you were still finishing your PhD at the University of Maryland. You've been in Washington for a long time now. Um, what were things like before October 23? What was the trajectory domestically on Palestine before 23? And what have things been like over the past 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, um, trying to think about how to start answering this question. Obviously, there's a lot of time before October 23, right? And I think some of the most important shifts happened well before then, or at least the ground began to shift well before then. I've been in working in the DC area, in and around these issues for 2 decades now. And when I first got down here, it was in the early years post 9/11. And you can imagine what that environment was like to do work related to Palestine. Obviously, the Second Intifada is going on. The U.S. is deeply engaged in war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The security state is on steroids in that period. We still had color-coded warning signs and all that stuff from the post 9/11 moment. And there was also a lot of bipartisan consensus around U.S. support for Israel at the time. And that really began to shift, I think, over that time because of a couple crucial moments. One of them was the Israeli war on Lebanon in 2006. Then the war on Iraq in 2008, 2000, sorry, the war on Gaza in 2008, 2009, which, the Israelis called Operation Cast Lead. And that was followed, of course, by successive wars on Gaza, each which was more horrific than the last. And I think, in this moment, it's almost hard to imagine because of the scale of destruction and catastrophe that we have seen in Gaza over the last couple of years. But 2008, 2009 was a paradigm shifting moment then. At that moment, as you know very well, that level of violence had not been used against Palestinians up until that point. And there was sort of a cumulative effect of these different massive bombardments in Lebanon in 2006, in Gaza again in 2014, and so on. And this was happening alongside a couple of other things as well. One of them is something I know that we'll talk about, which is the growth of civil society efforts to demand accountability for Israel's treatment of Palestinians. But also kind of I think, awakening here in the United States about U.S. foreign policy in the region, the mistakes of the Bush administration, the successful, I think, effort by the Obama campaign to sell a different message about U.S. engagement in the world. And then, of course, at the same time, the really adversarial relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and Barack Obama during the periods in which they overlapped. as the sort of the leaders of the U.S.-Israel relationship. All of those things together really shifted the way people thought about this issue and the politics of this issue over that time period. And what we began to see, of course, was a growing partisan divide, right? This has been poll tested for dozens and dozens of years. And there's a very clear partisan shift that suddenly emerges really in the last 15 years or so.
Mhm.
And, you know, what happened over that time is that shift accelerated. Um, and one of the things that, we started to see recently is kind of a move away from what has been the norm in public opinion, which is this partisan divide. And we're starting to see actually a lot more criticism on different parts of the spectrum today.
Well, so
Um,
before we get to the
yeah.
the current moment, I realize I'd like to ask about your subjective perception of how things changed as a policy person within DC. So is it that the young staffers you meet on Capitol Hill were suddenly, in the say the second Obama administration, suddenly speaking differently about Israel, or are you take people taking more meetings with you? You at the time you were leading USCPR. How did the day-to-day conversation change as somebody who's embedded within the policy apparatus of the United States?
I mean, there's a lot of different things that you can point to, right? I mean, just in terms of the practical level, in terms of the legislative space, right, and the policy making space, there was a period of time where if you were trying to organize a briefing on Capitol Hill, um, no member would rent a room for you or make a room available for you for your group if you were doing something on Palestine. Okay. That started to change as the politics started to shift, particularly among Democrats, right? And it's just sort of one example of it. At the same time, because of the growth of civil society efforts to demand accountability, we began to see a lot of repressive efforts in the legislative space, anti-BDS legislation, right?
And this
Efforts.
preceded 23.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. So we started seeing stuff like that on the state level. I mean, really, there are precursors, I think, as early as 2011 and not anti-BDS legislation, but really legislative efforts at the state level to kind of police discourse on this issue, right? And then anti-BDS legislation at the state level and at the federal level really in the mid-teens that start to really pop up, right? Um, so all of that is going on at the same time. There is the shifts in public opinion. There is the personnel as policy issue. Look, there's a lot of people in rooms that have been in these rooms and making decisions for 20 years. At some point, that group is going to start to shift a little bit, right? And there's going to be a new generation or new voices that are in those spaces that are starting to push for different outcomes. All of that, I think, is part of it. The relationship between Netanyahu and Obama also, I think, led to a lot of openings because even for Democratic politicians who were friendly to Israel, what was understood as a attack on the Democratic president by the Israeli prime minister gave them space to be a political space to be more critical. And so all of this is kind of happening, I think, at the same time, and that was the general trajectory of moving towards more criticism, more openness, more political possibility, still limited, of course, right?
And
Well,
mainly confined to the Democrats at
and
that time.
mainly confined to the Democrats. Now, one important thing we should talk about here. Um, a lot of this change is happening at the grassroots level. A lot of this change is happening in institutions outside of the Beltway. A lot of this change is happening in public opinion, right? One of the important places where there wasn't significant change yet, and I don't think there really is so far, but perhaps in the future there will be, is in the electoral giving space, which has a tremendous impact in shaping policy. On so many issues, um, public
So you
opinion.
mean PACs now? You mean bundled contributions, those kinds of things.
Correct. Bundled contributions, contributions directly to candidates, contributions to campaigns, PAC contributions, which end up supporting or opposing particular candidates, and so on. There is a significant amount of money that is mobilized in the direction of pro-Israel policy, and there is no counterbalance to speak of in the other direction. Okay. And that has a huge impact in shaping policy outcomes. And I think that is being challenged, but it still has a lot of weight, right? And
Right.
so while all these dynamic changes were happening over this time, and there was a general trajectory towards more openness and criticism, it wasn't in that space. And that was working to keep the status quo largely what it is, which was, of course, very pro-Israel policy, right? So
But it sounds
yeah.
yeah, it sounds like, excuse me, when you talk about the legislative efforts to ban the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement at the level of states in the decade preceding October 23, I interpret that to mean that we were winning the argument. The Palestine rights, the Palestine solidarity movement was winning the argument, and consequently, reactive forces, which are aligned with the Israel line, were trying to suppress the conversation. And so there was all of this priming at the grassroots level. And then you have October 23. And then what happens from a policy point of view? Again, you're ground zero for the policy conversation.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of policy in that moment is being heavily shaped by the occupants of the White House. And the political the particular political ideological orientation of one person, which is Joe Biden, who was president of the United States at that time, and the folks who are immediately around him. I mean, U.S. policy is what it is and has been for a very long time in terms of supporting Israel, its right to defend itself, its existence, unwavering, unshakable, unbreakable, all the kinds of synonyms that are repeated ad nauseum by American politicians on this issue. But what we saw from the Biden administration, I think, was something even more extreme than that. A level of support for a killing of Palestinians that I don't think we have ever seen before from any American president, and a willingness to use American power, finances, military assets, diplomatic cover to ensure that Israel can do that to the extent it wants for as long as it deems necessary. And that again, I think is unparalleled in American history when it comes to U.S. support for Israel. And I actually wrote something just before October 2023. And at the time, I was looking at Biden administration policy towards Israel. We had an American president who was a Democrat, right? In this context of a growing partisan divide in the United States around Israel. Part of that dynamic is also around the fact that there are many Jews in the United States who are Democrats. The majority of them are Democrats. The majority of those voters tend to be liberal and reform Jews who are increasingly critical of the religious direction that Israeli government policy is moving on Jewish issues, not related to Palestinians per se. And we had this moment where, obviously Benjamin Netanyahu comes with a lot of baggage. When Biden was vice president, he had a front row seat to the animosity between Obama and Netanyahu. And you had a government in Israel that was more extreme than ever before, not just in terms of its relationship with Palestinians, but also in terms of its agenda with Jews in Israel and around the world. And so, you know, it would seem, given that context, that the Biden administration should be a little bit more confrontational with this Israeli government, should be a little bit more adversarial towards this Israeli government. But it was really the opposite that was true. The Biden administration had backed away from the kind of criticism we used to hear from the Obama administration as far as settlement activity is concerned. They largely muted that, right? They didn't reverse the things that were passed by the Trump administration, the recognition of Jerusalem or Golan Heights, the attacks on UNRWA, and so on, right? And anything that they did do to kind of reverse what Trump did was really, really late in the game or limited. And at the same time, they were giving this Israeli government, this extremist Israeli government, all of these goodies, right? Pushing forward U.S. visa waiver program for Israel, which is something that Republican and Democrat administrations previously had opposed because of the way that Israel discriminates against Palestinian Americans, right? Now the Biden administration was finally saying, no, no, we're going to do this for Israel, right? In this moment in time, bending over backwards to try to advance Saudi normalization, right? With Israel. All of this before October 7th. And so I wrote a piece at the time asking myself, like, what explains this? What explains this Biden approach to Israel, given this context and in this moment and all of this politics should be, leading to a different outcome, but we get this extreme pro-Israel. And the only conclusion that I had that I could come up with is that Joe Biden himself is personally, ideologically committed to Zionism. And this is something that I think was very clear prior to October 7th of 2023. And then the results of that became plain for everybody to see in the policy of the Biden administration after the 7th and for months after that as well.
Right. And you anticipated my next question, which was really we spent the first part of the conversation describing this change the level of grassroots. It was barely perceptible at the level of policymaking, but it was there. Excuse me. And then you've got a president who behaves in a way that doesn't correspond to what the grassroots want. And so you've got this major disjuncture between what the president's doing and what the party wants at the level of poll taking and really in the early days, mass protest. And so you explain that um, through the personal beliefs of Joe Biden himself. But what about the people around him? Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan. I mean, my interpretation of the Biden era as well is that yes, a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist, a Jewish supremacist, who's committed to this fetishistic view of Jewish history in Palestine and Zionism itself. But he was addled. I don't want to overstate it, but I'd be surprised if Biden didn't have serious cognitive issues through 23, 24. So, so what about the people around him who committed to the policy, seem to have been committed to the point of view, and then were mendacious and cynical in lots of the ways that they behaved as well?
Look, I don't think there were many diverse opinions around Biden in at the highest levels of policymaking on this issue in the moments of crisis, right? They were not going to challenge him. I think it's important to remember that Biden himself, first of all, he's much older than most of the people around him, right? And he has a long history of experience in national security and foreign affairs. He was the vice president. He spent years on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. He's been there for a very long time, and I think that when you're surrounded by people 30 years younger than you, right, who don't have anywhere near the experience that you have, they're less likely to challenge you a whole lot on issues of on foreign affairs issues. And I also don't think there was a huge ideological difference between them. I think they were largely on the same page. Now, we can have a separate conversation about whether or not that setup is really healthy for policymaking. I don't think it is, right? I think it's actually very dangerous. And the results we saw, I think, tell us exactly why. But I think those reasons contributed to a policy that was from the outside very obviously broken, right? And yet continued to move forward as is. It was like a slow motion train wreck that we were all watching, right? And it became very clear that the Democratic voters were not in support of this, right? That the base of the party was not in support of this, and that there were going to be political costs to this policy as an election approached. And nonetheless, that train kept moving forward towards the wreck, right? Steadily. And there was nobody who was stepping on the brakes, nobody who was willing to move things in a different direction, in large part because the guy at the top, I think, really was committed. If there was one thing he was going to accomplish in his life, he felt it probably was that he would have been the person that was always standing next to Israel in its hour of need. That's the way he understood, right? This issue, I believe it cost them the White House. And I think many people would share that assessment as well. And it didn't matter to him.
Right. Uh, so fast forward 2 years, genocide. There's a massive rupture on the right. We see actors, probably some who are more sincere than others. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene strikes me as a sincere person. We don't share the same politics on lots of things, but I appreciate what she's done on Palestine. I think Thomas Massey is another person who comes across as sincere, but then there are others who come across as less sincere, and maybe instrumentalizing the issue for whatever reason. In any case, you have a massive rupture on the right. What's your perspective on the Coalition for Palestine Activists? So there's left politics, there's the Palestine issue, and then there's this rupture on the right. What do you think of that constellation? Is there a coalition in the making?
Yeah, I mean, this is the million-dollar question at the moment. I think it was easy to speak to a certain part of the spectrum, right, when it comes to Palestine organizing, because there was a values-based message that resonated with that part of the spectrum, right? We can talk about human rights, equal rights, freedom, a message that opposes discrimination, the importance of international law. All of these things resonate more or less on the liberal left side of the political spectrum. But in recent years, um, they've been less effective on the right. And the values on the right have been really different, particularly in the Trump years, but I think the origins are before that as well. There is a really strong xenophobic sentiment on the right, anti-Muslim sentiment on the right. There's the entire dynamic of evangelical Christian support for Israel and the sort of biblical fundamentalist approach to foreign policy on the right as well. So the Palestine advocacy message to the right was not resonating and shouldn't have been expected to resonate. And it's one of the reasons I think why for a very long time, there was much more openness growing among Democrats, but really far less openness among Republicans. Okay. There was a point in time 30 years ago where there were some Republicans who were much more willing to be critical of Israel than there are today, right? Or there were prior to October 23. Um, so what I think has started to change now is that actually the coalition on the right is starting to change, and the values of the coalition on the right are starting to change. And a lot of that is because of Trump and what he's done with the Republican base. And so there is a different understanding of what should drive American foreign policy and interests in the world than there was in the GOP base that supported, let's say, George W. Bush. Okay. It's no longer about bringing democracy to other parts of the world. It's no longer about, necessarily about this biblically fundamentalist approach to foreign policy. There is this idea of America first, right? And America first has implications for U.S. foreign policy and also domestic policy. And this is where it gets much more messy because America first includes in it a sort of anti-immigrant nativist vibe, but it also includes a very deep suspicion of foreign influence and a very deep suspicion of foreign entanglements. Okay. And this is where the space for criticism of U.S. support for Israel really finds openings on the right. But it's dangerous for the reasons I think that you alluded to in your question, is that there is a set of politics that comes along with that in relation to people of color in the United States, Muslims in the United States, immigrants in the United States, that clash with the very sort of values message the Palestine advocates are focused on delivering to other parts of the spectrum. Um, I think one of the challenges is this all happened so very quickly. We've had many conversations for years about, okay, there's this growing space on the left, and perhaps that will continue to open and will create more opportunities. But how do we cross the divide, right? How does this become a more mainstream issue? And it just seemed much further away. It was hard to imagine a moment that would catalyze the dynamic to the point where we would have to suddenly confront that in the near term. Excuse me. But it seems like here we are, right? And the question is there a way to build an advocacy coalition that straddles all these interests and actors in a direction of positive policy change? It's super complicated. I think there may be possibilities. And I think, the most important agenda item should be around ending military financing for Israel, ending military weapon sales to Israel, right? I think that is something that can be argued for with a values-based message that resonates on the left, but also a national interest-based America First style message on the right as well. Um, can that translate to actual legislative mobilization by people who have to be reelected and people who have to gather campaign contributions? That's the big unknown. And that's where we come back to what I think still is the elephant in the room, that unchanged variable. It's when it comes to election giving, there's still a gigantic imbalance of power.
Right. But I think Rejoinder, so first of all, I appreciate the focus and the precision that you bring to the argument here, which is that coalition doesn't mean marriage, and but beyond that, a singular focus on the armaments issue, on the provision of deadly arms to Israel, which have allowed Israel to skirt any real responsibility for genocide, but also militarism generally. That's the potential point of agreement, and again, I don't want to use the word coalition, but at least policy agreement here. The rejoinder to the, because Citizens United, I think, had such a damaging effect, and I'm waiting for a wave of Democratic candidates step up and say we're running on repealing Citizens United or revoking Citizens United, whatever it means. Um, but there does seem to be an expense attached to taking APAC money today, or a cost attached to taking APAC money today. And so, and then, the Democrats dramatically outraised Donald Trump in 24, uh, spent much more money on Oprah and other things, uh, and failed to win that election. And so, is there a mitigating or a complexity there that maybe we're missing? That is there a dimension to the question of funding which goes beyond just funding?
Yeah, I mean, So first, because you mentioned the APAC stuff, I think this is one of the really interesting dynamics that's starting to happen now, and we don't really know yet 100% where it's going to go. But it's certainly a sign, I think, of optimism. Okay, and the way I sort of explain where this has come from is, if you think about mass shootings when they take place in the United States, right? And they happen so often here, right? We've gotten used to sort of the national conversation that happens in the aftermath of those moments, right? There is the horrific violence, there's the focus on the victims, then there's the question of why does this keep happening here? What should the policy response be, right? And how is it that such a significant majority of Americans want to see simple steps taken, and yet this doesn't change? And then we start to focus a little bit on interest groups like the NRA. And then the news cycle moves on. And that's sort of where the conversation stops until the next mass shooting. Rinse and repeat, right? The difference with what we've seen over the last couple of years, I think, is that we're not talking about a single mass shooting that takes place in an instance, but we're talking about a genocide that's taken place every single day, with mass atrocities happening every single day, financed by the American government, and live streamed before the world. And so what happened is that the conversation didn't shift. It didn't shift away from, well, why isn't the policy changing? What is the obstacle to policy change? Why is it that even though Americans, the polls show, overwhelmingly support a shift in policy, that policy isn't changing? How is it that these elected officials can see the same things that we're seeing and not react with horror in the way that we individual Americans who are watching this react with horror? And so there's been far more focus on the role of pro-Israel interest groups in the policymaking process today in a sustained way that has never happened before. There are moments where it's happened before, but never in such a sustained way that's brought a level of scrutiny on the role of groups like APAC, which is really, I think, been devastating to APAC and has really turned their role in American policy into something that is toxic. I mean, to have members of Congress publicly swear off contributions from APAC, or endorsements from APAC. I mean, that was unthinkable a few years ago, right? So that, I think, is important. At the same time, when parties think about political strategy in the United States, they're thinking about political strategy in the United States at various levels, from local elections all the way through national elections. And there's a lot I think that you can do, and certain candidates have proven that you can do it with different funding models, whether it's Bernie Sanders or AOC or Zohran Mamdani, who swear off the PAC money, who focus on small dollar contributions. There is a model that's proven successful. But I think there's a lot of folks within the power structures in the Democratic Party, in particular, who still believe the path of least resistance, the easiest path to political power, is one that includes the financial contributions of pro-Israel interest groups and donors. And while there may be a path that you can imagine that excludes that, it's a lot harder. And it's not in the interest of the folks who are still in control of the party, for the most part.
Right.
And I think until that changes, it's going to continue to be a real challenge.
I think that's a very astute and sharp analysis, and it goes to the generational change, I think, as well. Well, one of the things I've observed is less that people change their minds than they're just replaced. Um, and so we'll see what happens in the next five, excuse me, years or so. In terms of opportunities for the Palestine solidarity movement, occupied people have a right to resist in various ways, but I think there are limits probably to how people in Palestine can resist what's happening to them, what's being done to them at this stage. And so the focus moves to other forms of resistance and what a solidarity movement can do. And here I'm talking about the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Earlier in our discussion, we talked about, you mentioned how different state legislatures were copy pasting legislation banning boycotts. Concretely, you couldn't get a tender from the government of the state of Texas if you indicated that you weren't going to work with Israeli companies. And it's baffling, right? Why should a contractor who mixes concrete for the state capital need to sign on to, I don't know, support for the state of Israel? Things have accelerated around BDS. Can you help me understand BDS, where it stands today? Is it a top-down movement? What does it look like here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, look, BDS is a set of tools. It has always been a set of tools that that Palestinian civil society has called upon global civil society to use as the best method of standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. I think that's what it has always been and what it continues to be today. Um, you know, People who want to stand in solidarity and should stand in solidarity with Palestinians in the United States and in countries elsewhere in the world that are supporting Israel's oppression of Palestinians have a very important role to play. And working to change the policy of those governments is, I think, the most important contribution that they can make. Now, there are very different ways that that can happen, right? And for all of the reasons that we discussed, changing policy at the federal level has all sorts of challenges, right? But the federal level is not the only place that you can begin to create change. And I think one of the reasons why we saw the degree of change that we saw over the last several years is because so much groundwork was laid by efforts at all different levels of American society, in church groups, at universities, in municipal councils, to educate people about what U.S. policy is and to demand change through tools like boycott and divestment. I continue to believe that the most important impact of calls for boycott and divestment is not the dollars and cents change that may result out of a particular campaign, but the education that happens in the process. The fact that people in some random Protestant church in Kansas are thinking about their complicity in the abuse of Palestinians thousands of miles away is itself far more important than any decision that they might make about a particular investment. I believe the impact of that education over the long term will be far more decisive than the shifting of dollars and cents in that moment. Okay. And that has been happening all over the country at different levels for many years now. And it's created a fertile ground from which far more change can happen at different levels of society, including in the policy space. There has also been a massive reaction to this, right? On the part of Zionist organizations and politics who want to see this movement crushed.
And so then
Um,
what's the theory of change here? I mean, education, I buy it. I understand. How does education or mobilization around education percolate upwards or diffuse into the policy space? Is it electoral politics?
I think electoral politics is absolutely part of it. There's also cultural change that has to happen. I think we're starting to see that as well. But none of this is going to happen fast. I think it takes time, a very long period of time. It might come quicker than we anticipate. And I think there have been things over recent years that have proven to be catalysts, right? Including the horrific genocide in Gaza that has kind of accelerated where people are on these issues and forced the question to be asked and answered by many people who weren't comfortable thinking through these issues prior to that. But yeah, I think it's all of these things, right? And I think, again, a very crucial component, one that there still really isn't enough of an answer to, is where's the electoral giving?
Hmm.
How do we address that imbalance? And I agree with you 100%. The Citizens United stuff it's not just about this issue. It's just about the role of money in our political system in general. It is obscene beyond description. And it has done a damage, I think, to any prospect of American democracy more than really anything else in recent history. And it would make so much sense for there to be an effort to try to change that, not just for the good of this issue, but really for the good of people who want their voice to actually mean something in our political system and not be overtaken by a small handful of people who just have a ton of resources.
I had somebody use the word oligarchy recently in conversation, and my first reaction was, this is hyperbole. I understand it, but my second reaction was, why is this hyperbole? This sounds actually broadly right. And it does feel like we're living in oligarchic times when somebody like Larry Ellison can buy the media, that's TikTok, CBS News, and impose on this issue an Israel, a monolithic Israel view. Um, when it comes to boycott, I want there's a tension here around education, which I buy, which I agree with, and then boycott is a principled undertaking. So I'm one of the people who signed on to the boycott letter for the New York Times.
Mhm.
I think the New York Times has played really um, a malign role in the past few years through its sexual assault hoax, the story, the Screams Without Words, which has been thoroughly debunked. There's no evidence of systemic sexual assault orchestrated by Hamas on October 7th, and that was a central pillar of the genocide. And that's a big statement. I know one that people may react to in different ways, but we'll link to the Intercept reporting showing that the story was really manufactured, thinly sourced, fabricated in parts. So, in any event, how do you take something like the New York Times boycott, and people are calling for the retraction of that story, which happened with Judith Miller and aluminum tubes, I think, with the Iraq War. Um, how do you take that and assess it against or evaluate it against the the need to educate and reach more and more people in this country, which is underwriting the occupation, the genocide, apartheid?
Yeah, it's a fair question. Look, the New York Times has been comically bad on this issue. And there's a history of bad journalism on this issue at the New York Times, slanted journalism, very obviously anti-Palestinian, pro-Israel bias in the journalism from the New York Times. Um, uh, they have outdone themselves over the last couple of years. Every once in a while, you can point to a piece here or there, which does some justice to the reality on the ground. But the overwhelming representation of the issue from the New York Times has been beyond disappointing. Um, I am very grateful that today we live in a world where the New York Times is not the only source of information, where mainstream media is not the only source of information. And there are lots of different ways to get your perspective out, to find out about what's happening around the world. And I think this is one of the things that has created the kind of awareness and created the kind of change that we've been seeing, right? And I wrote about this many years ago. There was a journalist at the time, for an editor at the time for Al Jazeera, who reached out to me, who said, we want to do sort of a forward-looking piece. And can you imagine sort of where we will be 10 years from now when it comes to Palestine and Israel? This was back in like 2012 or something like that. And what sort of change will happen over this time period, right? And one of the things that I identified at that time was that, like, look, the way that the availability of information is changing right now is going to radically alter the way people understand this issue. It's no longer going to be filtered through a few mainstream outlets, which have pro-Israel editors and pro-Israel publishers, and pro-Israel ombudsmen, and so on and so forth, who are really refereeing the discourse. That's going to change. Not only are these new mediums going to allow voices that you previously did not hear to reach the rest of the world, but they're also going to force a change in the way people perceive mainstream media. Because once you, as the consumer of news, realize that the mainstream media is failing to properly represent this issue because now you're starting to understand it from a different source, well, suddenly the most important asset that mainstream media has, its credibility starts to evaporate, right? And this then feeds a cycle that also has some dangerous downsides too, right? But also a cycle that makes people seek information in alternative places. I think boycott needs to be strategic. And perhaps there was a time when a boycott of the New York Times would have been more damaging to the effort to get information out and to educate the masses about the situation on the ground in Palestine. That's not the reality today. I personally don't see any contradiction there.
My final question, I'm just going to recapitulate what this editor asked you to do 10 years ago or 13 years ago. Wow. Um, can you tell me what you believe based on everything we've talked about and based on the domestic environment? We didn't talk about the situation in Palestine, Israel, but I think most people who listen to this podcast will be deeply immersed in that world anyway. Where do these forces coalesce and where are we going? Where's the world stand in 10 years?
You're kind of putting me on the spot. I would probably want to think a little bit more deeply about this before giving you too much too much analysis here. But look, I think, um, I- and I've been thinking for some time, I worry about the next genocide. Um, I think that what Israel did still is doing in Gaza. It's something that so far it has been largely able to get away with without serious repercussions. And I think what we have seen historically is that Israel has constantly tested the limits of what it can get away with before then trying to do much more. And everything we've seen in Gaza over the many different iterations of war on Gaza, I think supports that analysis. So, what lesson will it take from this? What lesson will it take from the fact that it can destroy the homes of 1 million people, 2 million people, erase entire urban areas, cities, infrastructure, kill tens of thousands of people, and pretty much get away with it? What message will they take from that when it comes to the West Bank? So the prospect of the next genocide is something that I worry about a great deal. I also think that in terms of sort of Israel's reputation, is that it's probably impossible to recover from what they've done in Gaza. And I think because of that, you mentioned earlier that they've kind of conceded that they've lost the argument when it comes to anti-BDS legislation. They absolutely have, and that came a long time ago. But they have not conceded their position. They've just conceded the fact that they're not going to be able to win an argument about it. So that means to maintain their position, they're going to have to find a way to either shut down the argument, or just prevent argument from happening altogether. And I think that means we're going to see a significant increase in repressive efforts, both by the Israeli government itself and across the world, through the governments that are allied with it here in the United States and elsewhere. Um, at the same time, I also think, Israel has in many ways backed itself into a corner. Um, there is no vision in Israel today put forward by any serious political leader that doesn't envision constant warfare as the path forward for Israel and for Israelis in a ever expanding uh, arena of warfare. I don't know how that is a good thing. If you are, a supporter of the Zionist project or an Israeli who just wants to live in Israel, how that vision is one that you really want to sign up for. And I think that ultimately will come with costs over time as well, you know? So these are different dynamics that I think will shape, the next decade to come. There's also the reality, as horrific as the war and genocide on Gaza has been, that despite that, the Palestinian people remain. They remain no less uh, clinging to their identity, clinging to their demands, clinging to their rights, and awareness about Palestine and all of those things is more broadly seen around the globe today than ever before. I also don't think that portends well for the Zionist project. So these are, I think, the factors that I would identify as over time continuing to shape the direction that we are going in.
Yousef Munayyer continues to be one of the sharpest analysts, really, for both domestic and I think Palestine related issues. I'm grateful to you for your time. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Ahmed. You're very kind, and I appreciate it very much.